Imagine that you're in town. You want to check your social media when you realize your entire network is down. That's strange, you think. Oh well, probably just a temporary glitch. It happens. Later, when you're headed back home, you look down at your phone and realize you still don't have any network connection. You would call your network provider to find out, but since you have no network, that's impossible. But at least you can still pick up some groceries for dinner. Or so you thought. Once you're trying to pay, it turns out your bank card isn't working either. You know the connections glitch sometimes because you're pretty sure you still had some money left on your spending account. Normally, you just check your phone banking app and transfer a little from one account to another. But since you have no network, that's not an option. Embarrassed, you leave the groceries and head home. Once you return and get back onto your home Wi Fi, you check your bank account. And that's when it hits you. You see several payments with your card for online stores you've never heard of before. In other words, somebody got hold of your card details. You immediately realize you have to block the card, but doing that requires you to call your bank's customer service, and you still have no network. So you run over to a neighbor and borrow their phone. After a very long time in the phone queue, a cheery customer representative from the bank blocks your card and gives you some details on what you probably need to do next. File a police report for identity theft and contact all of the dozens of different credit ratings agencies to ensure that your credit isn't being exploited by malicious actors. You also need to contact all the online stores that the purchases were made from to see if they can be stopped before any product gets shipped. So you start with the police. After another interminably long time in a phone queue, a police officer dutifully listens to you and asks you a number of questions to take down your report. Then, when you're all done, she levels with you. Look, she says, as much as I hate to say it, the reality is that we're unlikely to ever catch the person or people who did this. They're probably operating from a different country, so there just isn't much we can do. I don't want you getting your hopes up unnecessarily. Early the next day, you borrow the neighbor's phone, again, and begin the tedious process of calling one number after another. You start with your boss explaining that you can't come in today as you've had your identity stolen and need to spend some time sorting it out. You then continue with your phone network provider. It turns out that there's a very simple explanation for why your network signal disappeared. You see, the provider sent a new replacement SIM card to replace your old broken one to your temporary holiday address, just like you requested. Except, of course, you haven't been on holiday or requested any new SIM card or any of the other stuff you just heard. That must have been the scammers. So the customer rep blocks the SIM card they just sent out and issues you a new one that will arrive by post in 3 to 5 working days. But until then, you can't make or receive any calls or text messages. Also, those expensive international calls that somebody made from your number yesterday, you'll probably still have to pay for those. When you protest, you're told that, unfortunately, it's all in the terms and conditions which you agreed to when you signed up to become one of our valued customers. You then spend the day calling around to various different credit ratings agencies as well as the stores where the card purchases were made. And as you call around, you begin to understand the scope of the damage. Numerous payday text message loans have been taken out in your name and are now part of your credit history. Quite sizable sums. Likewise, it seems as though a number of purchases, including some very expensive international flight tickets, have been made via invoice, which will take a few days to arrive. As you speak to the various different customer reps, you understand just how much work you have ahead of you. First, you'll have to convince all the different lenders and airlines and online stores and so on that you don't, in fact, owe them any money. This will probably be easy enough with some of them, but almost impossible with others. And either way, you probably won't be able to remove the various credit checks and payday loans from your credit rating, which means that your chance of getting an actual loan of your own within the next few years is basically shot. So much for that mortgage you were thinking of. And, as if that all wasn't enough, it turns out your email has now also been hacked. Your password no longer works, and you can't recover it, because the click here if you forgot your password function sends a text message to your phone number which you still need to wait 3 to 5 working days to receive. You've had this particular email account for the past 15 years of your life, but now every single email, document, photo, video, and every other tiny scrap of information there from all those 15 years is in somebody else's hands, and you have no way of stopping them. Not until you get your new SIM card anyway. And in the meantime, they're free to poke around and probably reset passwords on all your social media and other digital accounts, since of course all of them depend on this specific email for verification. And this is probably the worst part of it all. Not all the insufferable hours you'll still need to spend in phone queues and help chats communicating with cheery but unhelpful customer reps. No, the worst part is that you know that somebody somewhere in the world has had full and unrestricted access to your email. They've been able to read all your old love declarations and acrimonious breakup exchanges, all your admissions of anxiety or weakness or guilt to friends or family, all those messages from years past that you now wish nobody would ever see, not to speak of all the photos of both you and others, many of which you really don't want showing up on the internet. All in all, it feels like a deep and painful violation of you as a person, of your ability to choose for yourself what you do and don't want others to know about you. In other words, because of identity theft, your privacy has just been completely trashed. Now, although this is a fictional example, unfortunately it's still an example based on the real lived experience of millions of people around the world on a regular and ongoing basis. The details obviously differ in each individual case, but 3 elements of identity theft seem to be relatively common and constant. First, that it takes a huge amount of time and effort to even begin repairing the damage done, like to your credit rating. Second, that you're unlikely to ever see justice done to whoever it was that stole your identity. And finally, third, that you feel your privacy has been grossly violated in a way that it can often be quite destabilizing and even debilitating. And this, my friends, this connection between privacy and data security is what we'll be talking about today. In the previous video, I made a point out of just how difficult it is to define the concept of privacy. But I also said that perhaps we don't need an exact definition and can still make progress on privacy-related concerns. Why? Well, for a very simple reason. Basically, no matter how any legal scholar or philosopher or similar defines privacy, they all agree that personal information is a fundamental and central part of it. The constitutional right to not be subjected to interference in important life decisions, like in Whalen v. Roe, there the debate rages on. But personal information, everybody agrees on that part. So as long as we stick to personal information, we can rest assured we're talking about privacy, no matter which definition we're starting from. And how do we know that we're only talking about personal information? Well, because data security, in the context of privacy, is really only about keeping personal information safely locked up and away from malicious actors. Okay, but given all the talking I did last time about how difficult it can be to define terms, what about data security? Maybe that's also difficult to find a good definition for. As it turns out, fortunately, it's quite easy. Basically, the concept of data security is just keeping data from falling into the wrong hands. Okay, some brief clarifications here. First, what is data? Well, data is really any information. Personal information, trade secrets, national security intelligence, metadata, it's all data. So data security is about keeping information secure. Of course, when we talk about privacy and data security, we're only really interested in the personal information part of the data, so let's just stick to that for now. All right, how about the wrong hands? Well, this differs a little depending on what sort of information we're talking about. But since we're limiting ourselves to personal information, then the wrong hands here simply means all the people and organizations that intend to use or actually do use your personal information in illegal ways. If the way they use your information is legal, then it's not an issue of data security in this context. However, keep in mind that I'll have plenty more to say in the next video about legal ways of using your personal information to manipulate you when we talk about privacy and autonomy. But for now, we'll leave that to the side. So, data security, particularly data security in regards to personal information. So I think we all know this is increasingly important stuff. Never before have we voluntarily given away so much personal information to so many different companies. From the companies that make our phones and tablets and smartwatches, through all the various software and app vendors, to the numerous membership discount cards and subscriptions we take out. And not only are we giving away vast amounts of our personal information, but the companies who collect and store them are also becoming increasingly good at using the tiniest bits of information all aggregated together to build extremely detailed and intimate profiles of who we all are. Your age, gender, and level of education? Easy to guess from very little personal information. Your raw intelligence and emotional and personality profiles? Pretty much the same. Your political and religious affiliations and your sexual preferences? Piece of cake. Your anxieties and worries and concerns about yourself and the world? No biggie. Whether or not your parents divorced, or how likely you are to divorce or use illegal drugs or get into a traffic accident, how far along you are in your pregnancy, or whether you're even likely to get pregnant or commit a crime or cheat on your taxes? Seriously, with the information we're all freely giving away, it's honestly a little surprising that our apps can't yet track when we're in the mood for a certain type of food and have it delivered to our doorstep at the precise moment we realize that that's what we have a craving for. Again, I'll go into this more in the next video, but for now, the main point is just that personal information is very lucrative, so companies all around the world have a huge incentive to make it work and to collect as much of it as they can. However, companies aren't the only ones interested in this information. I mean, sure, identity thieves and other digital criminals might not be interested in how much you're tapping on one sort of funny cat videos over another, but they don't have to. They're just interested in the basic things like your name, national identity or national security number, your bank card number, and a few other juicy pieces of information like that. And who collects that information? Well, almost any company or store you've ever bought anything from. Why do the criminals want this information? Well, it's pretty obvious. In the interest of making all our purchases as quick and simple and effective and painless as possible, we can't burden the consumer system with too many checks and security safeguards and so on. Name, a few numbers, maybe some proof that you're really who you say you are, like a bill or some form of ID or similar. Et voila, you're all good to go. But then, of course, the same goes for the criminals. They also just need a name, a few numbers, and some flimsy proof that they are you, and they're good to go as well. And although they could target individuals to get this information, why would they bother doing that? After all, there are literally thousands upon thousands of companies, each one with thousands upon thousands of customers whose personal information they all store in some nice big database. So if you're a criminal, then it's so much more convenient to get, let's say, 100 million people's personal information all in one go, compared to trying to steal personal information individually from 100 million different people. So this is, by and large, why we get data breaches. Ever since 2005 was dubbed the year of the data breach by InfoWorld, ever since 2006 was dubbed the year of the data breach by BusinessWire. Ever since 2007 was dubbed the year of the data breach by the Canadian Federal Privacy Commissioner. Come to think of it, every single year since 2005 has been called the year of the data breach by some media outlet or government office. Why? Wasn't it bad enough in 2005 when the credit card data of more than 40 million people was exposed in a hack at Card Systems Solutions, which served both Visa and MasterCard? You have no idea how good we had it back then. As this brilliant infographic from the superb website Information is Beautiful clearly shows, since 2005, the number of data breaches, as well as the number of individuals whose personal information was exposed as a result of these data breaches, represented by the size of the circles, has grown to truly staggering proportions. And unfortunately for us and everybody else, it shows no sign of slowing down anytime soon. You thought the 40 million people affected by the card system's solution hack sounded bad? How about the 500 million people from 106 different countries around the world whose personal information was scraped from Facebook in 2019 and posted freely online in 2021? I mean, statistically, chances are that the majority of you watching this video right now had your personal information exposed in this very data breach, at least assuming you've ever used Facebook. Now, I've put two links in the description below related to this. The first is a link to the Information is Beautiful infographic itself, so you can go explore it in all its glory. And you should, it's rather mind-boggling. In addition, in case you're now feeling a little paranoid, I've also put a link to the website haveibeenpwned.com, where you can see whether your email or phone number has showed up in any of the biggest data breaches so far. Just in case you're now feeling, well, a little paranoid. So, data breaches, they happen a lot, and more, and bigger with each year. So this leads to an interesting question. Why are there more, and why are they bigger each year? And relatedly, why isn't more done about it? Okay, let's start at the beginning. Why are there more data breaches each year, and why are they bigger than they used to be? Well, if we answer the latter question first, why data breaches are bigger than they used to be, then the answer is pretty straightforward. Because companies are storing and processing more personal information than they used to. Why? Well, as we already discussed a few minutes ago, because personal information is lucrative. So the more of it you have, the more you can do with it. All right, sure, that explains why the data breaches are bigger. But it doesn't explain why there are more of them each year. So what gives there? Well, here the answer is unfortunately also quite straightforward. Why more each year? Because organized crime is increasingly going digital and developing the tools and skills to do so more efficiently. So basically, from a digital criminal's perspective, it's not just that the cookie jars are way bigger than they used to be. It's also that they now have ropes and ladders and cranes and all sorts of fancy tools to make stealing the cookies that much easier. Woohoo! Or, well, maybe not, if you're not a digital criminal or otherwise trying to steal people's personal information. Okay, so organized crime going increasingly digital explains part of why the data breaches are happening more frequently. But there's another reason too, and it's one we'll spend the rest of this video and plenty of the next one talking about. And that is the notion of cognitive bandwidth. Basically, the idea that the human brain is only capable of dealing with so much information. And if you give it more, then it simply won't be able to handle it at all in any appropriate or meaningful way. Kind of like the way you'll have serious trouble paying attention to what I'm saying here if you're trying to count backwards in your head from 200 in steps of 17 at the same time. So cognitive bandwidth has a lot to do with how digital technology can undermine our autonomy, which again, we'll discuss in the next video. But it's also highly relevant in the way that companies themselves deal with data security. To illustrate, let's start by rehearsing some of the basic security recommendations for passwords. 1. Don't use an easily predictable password like password or hello or 12345 or minä rakastan sinua, that's I love you in Finnish, or similar. 2. Use a long password consisting of lots of different words or letters and numbers and symbols or similar. 3. Use a different password for every site or app or function that requires one. 4. Don't ever tell anybody else what your passwords are. 5. Change all your passwords frequently, and so on. Oh, and if we're talking about any piece of hardware with a password, like a modem or TV or robot vacuum or internet-controlled dishwasher or whatever else you might have around or fancy using, then make absolutely sure to change the default password from admin or default or change me or whatever else it might be. Now, how many of you follow all these rules with all your passwords? Nobody? No, I didn't think so. Even if we follow every other rule, the combination of both having unique passwords for every site and app and so on, and changing them all frequently can put together be enormously time-consuming, not least given how many passwords the average person tends to need nowadays. So we fudge, we take shortcuts, we assume the bad stuff won't happen to us. Now, it might surprise you to hear this, but as it turns out, people who work in big companies are, well, also people. And so they also have, well, the same sort of cognitive bandwidth as the rest of us. So as it turns out, many of the data breaches that have happened over the years are because of this precise issue. A company can invest millions in data security, hiring a whole team of security experts, locking its systems down, using military-grade encryption, and basically ticking every single box. But then a third-party subcontractor who needs temporary access to the system in order to install some piece of hardware plugs in his own laptop, which is obviously teeming with viruses after he clicked a phishing link promising a get-rich-quick scheme. And perhaps the company is lucky, perhaps the viruses are contained at first because of the way their systems are locked down. But then, oh no, wouldn't you know it? They forgot to tell the maintenance guy, let's call him Fred. They forgot to tell Fred over at server farm number 86 that he needs to remember to change the default hardware password from admin to something better. The hackers managed to install a backdoor, and it's already game over. Oh, and if you think the solution to this is that we just need more and better security, well, again, I'll point you to the infographic from Information is Beautiful. Most companies take data security extremely seriously, but they still consist of people, and at the end of the day, people tend to be, well, kind of dumb. But what about the law, you say? Can't a law be used to provide incentives for companies to avoid data breaches, like punishing them severely with a big juicy fine if they suffer a data breach? Unfortunately, that kind of summarizes the approach we already have today. Companies suffer data breaches and they get fined for it. That's how the law works in the US. That's how it works in the EU through the GDPR. That's how it tends to work in any country with a highly developed digital infrastructure. And again, it's obviously not working. Part of the problem here is that companies need to remain user-friendly and accessible. If a company has such severe security measures that it takes hours just to set up a basic account, then even if this is done in the interest of security, most users just won't be interested. To your average consumer, promises of near-complete security will never outweigh extremely laborious setup and login processes. It doesn't matter if the company is offering 4-factor authentication with 2 separate biometric measures of your choice if it means you have to type in your password, provide your fingerprint, scan your iris, and provide a text message code each time you want to use their stupid app. And not only that, many people would be wary of providing their fingerprints and iris scans to a company they don't already know and trust to a very high degree. After all, what's to say that the company doesn't suffer some data breach because of Fred or some similar issue? Now, not only has your password been leaked online, but your fingerprint and iris scan as well. Ouch. All right, so what can we do about all this? If cognitive bandwidth limits everybody's ability to stay safe in the digital environment, including the people who work for the big companies that do all the collection and storage and processing of millions of individuals' personal information, then what can we do to improve the situation? Or in other words, how can we be a bit better about protecting privacy while keeping in mind our natural human limitations and the restrictions this puts on any data security solution in the real world? Unfortunately, that's a difficult question to answer. For me, here in this video, I'm going to merely provide a number of suggestions, most of which come from Daniel Solove and Woodrow Hartzog's 2022 book, Breached: Why Data Security Law Fails and How to Improve It. In their book, Solove and Hartzog provide several concrete suggestions that are all worth considering as solutions to the situation I've described in this video. And although I can't cover all of the suggestions they provide, I will say a few words about those that I think have particular potential. The first is one that many users are already familiar with, and that's 2-factor authentication. Typically, this means verifying on your phone after logging in with a password. It's available with many different services, but it should perhaps be more of a default option than it currently is. Now, it's not foolproof, as illustrated by the identity theft example I began this video with, but on average, it makes it that much more difficult to gain illicit access to somebody else's account. Second, people should consider using password managers to help them both generate unique passwords for every site and app and so on that they use, and to store them all in one convenient place. Obviously, there are security risks here. If a digital criminal gets access to your password manager, they'll have access to all your passwords. So the entryway must be securely locked down, ideally with a strong password and two-factor authentication. Now, I've provided links to some well-established password managers below. Oh, and generally, don't use the built-in password managers in your browser. I mean, they do tend to be fine and they're safe enough, but they have quite limited features compared to the third-party managers. Third, given all the phishing that occurs these days, and often with very realistic-looking emails and links and sites and all, we should really push to require so-called mutual authentication. This is where every time you need to log into a site or app or similar, it starts by showing you something that you chose during sign-up, and which only you know, a password or a photo or similar. This would be the company's way of proving to you that they are who they say they are, so that you could trust that it would be safe for you to enter your login details without them being stolen. Now again, obviously, this sort of added functionality has the risk of misuse. A digital criminal who gets access to all a company's user authentication images in this manner could then really pose as the real company and probably be much more efficient at phishing. But that's sort of the thing with all these suggestions. None of them completely solve the problems, and none of them are completely risk-free. Then again, chances are that they would push the overall balance of security in a slightly more stable and reliable direction. Fourth, companies should really set security by default. When a new user signs up for an account, everything should be as locked down and protected and private as possible. It should then be up to the user to enable additional functionality by, for instance, making their posts available to friends or whatever. Now, this is a suggestion without much of any negative or risky side effects for you and me as private individuals. But for the companies, this would undermine big chunks of their business models. Imagine if Facebook by default didn't share your photos or posts with anybody, and you had to manually unlock that functionality each step of the way. If that had been the default from the beginning, then although it arguably would have been a lot better for Facebook users' privacy, it's also arguable that the network wouldn't have taken off in the first place. Fifth, and related to the last point, any collection or storage or processing of personal information should necessitate two things: data minimization and data mapping. Data minimization is, as the name suggests, when a company minimizes the amount of data they collect and store in the first place. So instead of grabbing every single piece of information available, they only collect what's absolutely necessary for them to do their thing, whatever that thing is. Paired with this, data mapping is when a company maps out all their data, specifying what information is being collected, how and where it's being stored, what it's being used for, and so on. By keeping this sort of map or overview available and up to date, the company can make sure none of the information they have collected is forgotten. Now, this is important because forgotten data often falls outside stringent and up-to-date security standards, and so typically becomes vulnerable to access by, for instance, digital criminals. Now, like the previous point, this one's not obviously against the interests of any individual user, but will likely affect the bottom line of a company. In other words, unless it's required, we shouldn't expect to see it anytime soon. Finally, to the previous 5 points, I'd like to add another. I'm not the first to think of it or the first to argue that it ought to be adopted, but I'd like to add my own perspective on it. You see, privacy in the distant past was to some extent maintained by the fact that personal information decayed. People forgot what you might have said or done. Records that existed only on paper or papyrus or clay tablets were prone to being lost or destroyed. And there was no capacity to keep track of every little thing you said or did in the first place. So a company that today wants to take privacy and data security seriously really should implement personal information decay as well. That is, to set up their personal information storage in such a manner that the information is automatically and irreversibly removed, cleared, expunged after a given amount of time has passed. As I'm sure you can appreciate, a data breach of 500 million users, but where basically all the personal information has already been purged, is not a particularly lucrative data breach for digital criminals, and so would make the entire digital ecosystem a far more secure space. Unfortunately, however, as I'm sure you can also appreciate, getting today's multinational tech conglomerates to implement personal information decay, and thereby to at least partially undermine their very business models, is a bit like expecting a dog to save a goal. It could happen, but probably best not to count on it anytime soon. But that point, that what's good for privacy tends to be not only the opposite of what's good for digital criminals, but also kind of the opposite of what's good for tech company profits, that's a point we'll get into in the next video when we discuss privacy and autonomy. I'll see you there.